Awesome. Well, greetings, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us on our presentation entitled Plan to Deploy and Manage Updates for Windows 10 and Office. Essentially, what we're going to do today is introduce you to a framework that my peer James Bell has put together with regards to plan, prepare, and deploy for updates and servicing. So he's going to do a deep dive into the plan session, but first we'll definitely give you some insight into what the overall framework is. Primarily what we want to accomplish today is put you in a path to succeed with regards to moving from a project-based approach to more of a process-centric approach to servicing all up. And then throughout the presentation, we'll sprinkle in some technical features, capabilities, as well as tooling that'll make the process flow much more efficient and seamless for you. So first off, I'm Dave Bachman. I am an evangelist for Windows 10, Windows as a Service, and the modern desktop. I work in the Windows Servicing Delivery Organization. We are the org that actually manages the 1 billion devices in the world. So we've got quite a bit of experience with regards to servicing. So look forward to sharing some of that stuff. James, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Hi, I'm James Bell. I'm a product marketing manager for the Microsoft 365 apps and endpoints team. And a lot of my focus is around Windows servicing and making sure our commercial customers can stay current.
So James, you've been working on this servicing framework for quite a while. I actually just published a blog around what the servicing framework is all about. Can you give us a high-level overview of what the framework looks like and kind of the benefits and what you're trying to drive with this new servicing framework?
Happy to. So the servicing framework that we want commercial customers to align on is around a plan, prepare, and deploy motion. And by going through that process, each time you do an update, you can really see the benefits that you get with Windows 10, whether that's through more advanced security, enhanced productivity, better management tooling, or simplified updates. And the more that process happens, the more benefits that you'll see as we go through. So we really want to talk in this presentation around that servicing framework and how to best plan for getting the most out of it in your organization.
So it's important to remember as we talk through this servicing framework, we are talking servicing all up for the Microsoft stack. So Office, Windows, and even things like Edge and some other opportunities around SCCM. So certainly it is very applicable across the board from all of the M365 solutions. So unless we specifically call something out, it should be applicable across the board. Before we start, one of the things that I want to address is currency. And when I talk about currency, I'm not talking about cash. I'm talking about why currency matters with regards to servicing and keeping up to date across the stack with all of our solutions. In this instance, we're talking specifically to Windows. So I don't expect you guys to read the slide. It's very dense. But there are a couple of key points that I want to use it to illustrate. The first is the agile nature at which we're actually moving. So the net new is all in blue. So you can see all the great new features and capabilities we're adding feature set over feature set. I'm going to get into specifics of those here in a little bit. This slide really illustrates the fact that from 1709 and previous, well, actually 1709 is going to go out of service come November 13th. And then everything prior to 1709 is end of service. So keep in mind, if you are running one of those older feature sets on devices within your estate, you are at risk. You've got a hole in your perimeter that the bad guys are able to exploit because you're not getting patches and security updates for those feature sets that have gone out of date. So if you're running any of those, highly recommend you update those as soon as possible. The other thing that I want to call out that is pretty obvious is Win 7. So Win 7 is obviously end of life. And for those that have purchased ESUs and plan to continue leveraging the ESUs, as of January 14th of this coming fiscal, you're going to run into challenges, and we'll need to repurchase the ESUs as well as apply the new SKU and license so that those patching and updates actually continue to flow. Obviously, we want you to move off of those sooner than later. And if you hadn't seen recently, the FBI just announced a private sector notification. They call it a PIN notification on the increased cyber threat and attacks that are being focused directly on Win 7. So the sooner you get off of those, the better. Anything else you want to add, James, before I pop on to the newer feature sets?
Yeah, thanks. What I would say with this slide is it can be quite daunting. You can see the amount of new features that are there, and I think it really serves, looking at it to see the amount of innovation that still goes into Windows and the amount of things that you can configure and control. I think it's also really important from a planning perspective to have the right approach to navigate that. So some of those capabilities on the screen you're going to get by default. Some of them you're going to need to enable, and some will have requirements before they can be used. So thinking about how to approach that in a structured way is really important as updates are released, and that's some of the content that we'll be going through as part of this presentation.
Excellent. Thanks, James. So the other thing that I want to talk about is some of the newer feature sets and what we're doing to improve life from an IT professional perspective as well as the end user. So currency definitely has its advantages. Certainly the key value prop for Windows 10 is around security. And so feature set over feature set within the blue, you'll see significant improvements around the security capabilities. Obviously productivity for the end users, simplification. But for me, as a former IT professional, what really intrigues me is the manageability and all the new features and capabilities that we've been providing to the IT professional to streamline the process, reduce package sizes, minimize bandwidth impact, reduce the impact on the end user, and actually amplify and simplify, streamline the update process. So things like delivery optimization, which we're going to get into. So this plan session that we're talking about today is the first of 3 in a series that we're going to talk about this plan, prepare, deploy. Throughout there, we will talk about some of these solutions like delivery optimization, which is peer-to-peer caching, things like express updates. So prior to 1809, express updates for the monthly patches was essentially a configuration you had to implement to leverage differential updates, which shrunk the packages significantly. Beginning in 1809, express updates is actually built into the solution, so there's no management. But things like delivery optimization, dynamic updates, and then most recently announced in 2004 is the Microsoft Connected Cache solution, which is essentially delivery optimization on steroids. And over the next 3 sessions, we'll get into some of those and just whet your appetite enough to actually want to go in and delve into some of that stuff. The other thing that we did to streamline updates, beginning in the 1903, 1909 timeline, we changed the approach where each feature update used to be a full-on OS swap. We changed that in 1903, where all the features and capabilities for 1909 were actually baked into 1903 in a dormant state. So if you were moving from 1903 to 1909, it was as simple as applying the service stack update as well as an EKB to actually update the machine. So again, currency, if you're moving from 1903 to 1909, like we did internal to Microsoft IT, you could see update times of around 5 minutes. So significant improvements. And then the fastest time that we actually clocked moving from 1903 to 1909 was 1:27. So you can see the significant changes we've made. Moving into the 2004 and 2009 series, we're going to do the same approach to help streamline the updates. James, any other comments?
I think you've covered it all there, Dave. I mean, that's a good overview of what we're trying to do in the currency space. And if I think about the framework itself of plan, prepare, and deploy, I'm a real process guy, so I like to know, what I'm going to plan for and how I'm going to get there. And to make that process easier, I've split out the framework from plan, prepare, and deploy into 4 separate sections as well. So if you think about it in terms of compatibility, deployment, capability, and modernization, it really helps frame out the different tasks that need to happen in each stage and what we need to do in order to be successful. As you can see in the slide, compatibility really is around making sure that all of your applications and your devices are ready to go for the next feature update. Deployment is making sure your infrastructure and configuration is ready to go, and also things like your support teams are ready to handle that update and any issues that may arise. I really see those 2 areas as the core pieces that you need to do to move from one feature update to another. And then as we move to the other 2 phases of capability and modernization, these are things that can really help you improve that process. So they can give you more value, both to the IT pro and the end user. And then modernization is activities that really help either reduce the cost, shorten the amount of time that it needs to take in order for that update to be applied, or streamline that operation and process. So that's how we're going to think about talking through the plan, prepare, and deploy phases, addressing each of these areas. And I really feel like plan is the most crucial of all of them, because if you can get that set up early and know exactly what success looks like in your organization, this process becomes so much easier as we go forward. So a robust planning stage is really important for any organization. And I say that for a few reasons. What companies typically do when they start from the plan process is they start more towards the deploy. So what they'll do is think, well, how many rings do I need in order to be successful to deploy to my organization? Personally, that's not the conversation I want you to have at this stage. What we should be thinking about in plan, if we think about each of those 4 pillars, is what does success look like as we move through the different phases? How do we align on the right terminology? So for applications, how do we think about classifying the apps that we have and know what we should test and when? For infrastructure, what do we have? What do we need to update in order for it to be successful? Not only at the prepare phase, but also, how is it ready for things like a pilot deployment and then broad deployment? We need to think about setting the right metrics for success, and they'll be different for every organization. So some customers might have an appetite for a bit more risk. They may be using some data-driven servicing tools to help them, make informed judgments about when to update. Other companies might think that they want more assurance and they want to do more testing, and that'll of course, push out the amount of time that things take to move from one update to another. And so this session is really going to be about exploring those different concepts and what success would look like for you. And so what we're going to do now is just dive into each of those different sections, starting with compatibility. So in order to be successful for compatibility, what we really want to come out of the plan phase is for you to have a good idea of what you have in your estate and what success will look like in your organization, both for apps and devices. What we find is that companies that don't know what applications they have and what importance they assign to those applications really struggle to get to the deploy phase. If you don't know what you have, it's really hard to test. And then when things go wrong, it's always hard to backtrack and get out and try and troubleshoot and remediate. So when we think about apps, what we want to do is make sure we understand what's in our estate, and then we want to go through a process of classifying those applications. Not every application is going to be critical. So there is certainly apps within each organization that the business just won't run without. So those are obviously critical and they need to be tested before we do anything for a broad deployment. For some applications that are important, it might be that we can get away with testing those during pilot, or we can start testing them in broad deployment. Maybe workarounds exist. Maybe I have a copy of a reader application that is helpful to use, but I have other ways of doing it, and I don't need to rely on that in order to move forward. So this is the time where we want to think about those sort of things. And also we want to think about the success criteria. So what does good look like for me as an organization when I've tested those applications? What percentage of apps should I test, and how many of those tests need to be successful before I'm confident in moving to a pilot deployment and a broad deployment. And those things will depend based on your company and what you want to do. But having those in mind really helps set the tone of what the bar is, and people can then be aligned on what success looks like for that organisation and how they can move forward. Enterprises in IT have had decades of experience with Windows, and they've been burned by a lot of the previous compatibility challenges that we've had. And so we really want to try and change that narrative with Windows 10, because we do have such a high compatibility bar with Windows 7 and with updates as they go through with Windows 10. And to extend that, we actually have an app assurance program where if you have an in-house application that you think has a problem or has a demonstrator problem, you can actually send it to us and we'll put an engineer on it to work with you to fix what that looks like. And so that's a real level of comfort that you can get by adapting this motion and staying current with Windows, that you have that confidence that those applications will be supported in the unlikely event that they aren't compatible. Dave, any additional thoughts on this?
So the only thing that I will add and kind of pile on is kind of what you mentioned, James, is really identifying, defining what that success criteria looks like before moving on to the next phase. Your line of business app owners need to be completely bought into the entire process, and they need to be the ones that are signing off and are comfortable enough that you're getting to that deployment decision so you can start rolling it out. Because if issues start to crop up, they're the ones that are going to be the first line of defense in the process. So certainly define what that success criteria is and measure before you actually start thinking about taking the next step.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there. And one other thing to mention is, we do have tools that can really help with this part of the process now as well. So desktop analytics is a tool that will help you classify applications and list out the inventory of what you have in your portfolio. And if you can do some edits of those at the planning stage within the tool and really use it to help you, you can use desktop analytics throughout the prepare phase as well to help you make data-driven decisions. The thing that I think about with Windows is, while an update might work for a selection of apps one time, it may not be for the other time. So, as you think about deployment rings and getting to broad deployment, those groups might change depending on what happens as part of each update. So we need to leverage tools such as desktop analytics to really help us make those decisions and put the devices that have those apps, as they're ready to go, they should be in the first group rather than being spread out on an update that was done 2 or 3 years ago. So let's switch focus from compatibility to deployment. And this is where we need to think about what needs to happen to our infrastructure and configuration in order for us to be ready for pilot and broad deployment. So we really want to plan what needs to change and where and what we need to update and the effort associated with that. So some of the common tasks we need to do here in the deployment planning phase are thinking about what needs to be updated and what management tools do I use, how they should be updated, and what configuration I need. We fully understand that while a lot of companies want to move to completely cloud-managed tooling, such as Microsoft Intune, that's not an option for them right now. And a lot of our customers rely on Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager to deploy at scale to their enterprise. And we want to make sure that you have all the information you need to prepare to move that forward. And so in this phase, we want to make sure that you're aware of the types of updates you need to do for your configuration manager environment and the types of things that you need to put in to handle that configuration. So things like security baselines, administrative templates, understanding when they're released and how to import them is really important at this phase, because then you can set a timeline of when they'll be available and ready in your environment to move to those next phases. And then after we've done that, we can then start thinking about, in the prepare phase, what rings look like and how would we go ahead and plan for our deployment. Dave, any other insights you want to provide here?
Yeah, James, I'll just pile on with regards to the administrative templates, the ADMX, essentially the policies as well as the security baselines. Don't reinvent the wheel. We publish that stuff. A lot of it's based on government entities. So from a security baseline perspective, a highly secure So leverage all the tools that we provide versus trying to reinvent the wheel, because it definitely is going to make your life much easier.
Yeah, absolutely. And with deployment planning, for those of you who have, say, third-party security tools, the supportability of those is another factor to consider here, and that may delay when you want to roll out. A lot of our third-party security tooling providers look to provide support as quickly as they can when a new update comes out, but it's also good to think about when that will be released and when you'll be supported, so that you can plan for that next part of deployment and when that should happen. And also think about your support and operations people at this point. What do they need in order to help support the update? Not only during the pilot, but also broadly. Are there things that we need to let them know about around updates that are going to happen? What's coming? When are we going to plan for these different updates to apply? And what can users expect? These are the types of questions that we can think about in this phase that will really help us as we go into deployment. And if we shift gears into capability planning, so Dave walked us through the slide, the eye chart of all the different features with Windows. And what we want to be doing here is really thinking about what benefit we can get beyond just updating the OS to do things like stay supported and improve our security. What are the end user features that we have that can really benefit our end user population, and what can we do to simplify administration in this phase? So there's a couple of things that we'd like you to consider here, and one is leveraging the Windows Insider program to test out new features. So that's a really good way to stay involved in what's coming in the next update. And typically when we release an update, that's when we announce a series of new features. But by having some insight into the Windows Insider program, you can really get an understanding of what's going to likely coming down the pipe, and that will help you plan for anything that you want to implement. Joining the Windows 10 tech community is obviously recommended. Both Dave, myself, and a number of our colleagues post there quite regularly on things to think about in terms of improvements to the process, new services or features that come out that can help you really shorten the time or reduce cost. And we're even going to have a blog post coming up in the coming months around planning specifically for capabilities and how to think about them. Thinking about them from an accessibility perspective, from a user experience perspective, or IT pro. And then also about how you message that to users. Depending on how you deploy, it could be that you deploy an update within, say, 3 months. It could be that it takes you 12 months or 18 months to deploy that update. Telling users about these new features will be different depending on what that looks like. And we'll start talking through some of those options as well. So the tech community is certainly a good place to go to stay up to date.
Yeah, James, I just want to reiterate the importance of the Windows Insider program. It really does give you 6 months early validation and testing, and it's where the new features really get surfaced. And I know the program is changing, and they're providing a lot more transparency around what the new features and capabilities are out. My guidance to most customers and the typical approach that I see with the Insider program is, a few of the disc jockeys within the IT organization join just so they can see the new bits and all the cool stuff coming out. My guidance is really build a formal program around it. Get other groups involved in the Insider program, from line of business app owners to some basic business users, just so that they can provide some basic feedback around some of the new features and capabilities that are really going to make an impact to the bottom line.
Yeah, that's absolutely a good call out. And if we switch focus now to modernization planning, I think the way to think about this is, every one of you has likely gone through an update process where you've taken your company through the update from start to finish, and you have a good idea of what that length of time takes. And it could be a number of things that make that a long process or a short process. It might be that it takes a lot of time to sign off on applications before you get to a point where you're ready to broadly deploy. It might be that you have a lot of effort from an administrative standpoint, selecting the right groups to deploy to and then deploying and doing things manually. And so what we want to think about with modernization planning is, what are the things that we can do to really improve that process, whether it's reducing cost, whether it's saving time, or whether it's speeding up deployment. And here is the time to think about it. So after we've done an update, have a think about the lessons that you've learned, and then see what you can do to really improve that process. If I think about Configuration Manager and Intune, there are things that we can do in the modernization section, even to trial to make that process better. For those of you who deploy updates through Configuration Manager, maybe there's an opportunity to pilot Windows Update for Business with Intune if you have them connected. You can start a pilot group and see what data-driven deployment looks like, maybe for devices that aren't critical. That way you can get a feel of that technology and what it looks like, and maybe that'll help from an administrative standpoint, reducing some of that time or effort. Things like desktop analytics, as we mentioned before, can take a lot of the manual processes out of testing applications. If we can rely on some of that data, then we can reduce the time it takes to get to a pilot deployment, and thereby reducing the amount of effort and what we need to do to go forward. So this phase is really there to help identify what you want to do and when you want to do it, and have a structured approach to doing that as part of each update cycle.
Yeah, the one thing I will say around modernization is get modern, especially in these days and times of the remote worker scenario. James and I actually have a fourth session that's going to be coming up on business continuity and reimagining IT, and getting modern via cloud management adoption and going to modern devices is absolutely critical to your success as we start to think about reimagining IT to support this new concept of a hybrid workforce. All right, so now we've kind of got an introduction into the servicing framework. James has talked about the planned phase of the framework. So what's next? Let's jump into kind of critical understanding of your cadence and your dependencies. Fully understanding the cadence and dependencies across the stack is absolutely critical, primarily because at least most of the stack for the endpoint all is getting multiple updates per year. So in the chart, you can see we've got ConfigMan being updated 3 times a year, and what's the impact to your organization and how often do you do that? My recommendation is do it often and as rapid as you possibly can, because as new features and capabilities, especially in management for Windows, get lit up, it's usually ConfigMan that requires some kind of an update to enable that capability within Windows deployment. Obviously updating M365 and the Office, they're rolling out 2-3 times a year. The security baselines and the ADMX templates also get released twice a year in conjunction with Windows, usually a couple weeks beyond the release date for Windows 10. So you've got 2 releases a year you need to deal with. And then to even more complicate things, we need to start to think about overlaying the new Edge Chromium solution, which is on a 6-week deployment cycle. So really understanding your cadence and what dependencies, so that you can actually start to map out, hey, here's what my kind of calendar is going to look like over the next year, and here what the release cycles are, so that you get into this project mentality of just an engine that's constantly just running itself and updating on a fairly regular basis. So, James, you got any thoughts around the cadence and dependencies?
I think this space can be somewhat daunting for IT pros as well. I mean, with the amount of updates we have across all of our products, it's really important to understand, the different things and when they come out and how to think about applying them. And in order to help with that, what we've done is come up with a calendar approach to really try and visualize what that might look like for your organization. And I've written a blog post about this on Tech Community, which you can go and check out. We'll have the resource link available at the end of the presentation. But this really helps to try and align those different products and when they come out, and how you can build that into your process. People have different cycles that they'll go on for Office, and as Dave mentioned, Edge and Config Manager, and then the appetite for updating will be different across organizations. So there's no one-size-fits-all calendar, but what we've done here is come up with just an example based on a Windows release cadence, of what success might look like. Now, we're very aware that no one snaps to our Windows release cadence. If I think about retail, for example, the busiest time of year is typically, November, December. So sometimes that won't align with what we have here, but it does serve as an overview of how you can start thinking about that plan, prepare, and deploy motion across each of the feature updates. And then, dependent on the edition of Windows you have, will help you understand how much time you have to move between updates as we go through this process. If you're on Pro, you typically have an 18-month support window after release. And if you're an enterprise or education SKU customer, you'll have 30 months. So that gives you a little bit more time to plan that accordingly. So certainly think about what cadence you're on across all of our different products. And then this will try and help you create that map of what I need to do and when, and think about your appetite for change as well as part of that. Dave, any other thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think one of the things you called out, James, that's spot on with regards to the calendar. It's not necessarily just when we're actually going to release something to the wild, but the calendar itself, as you can see, is multi-year. So capturing how long something is going to be serviced within the calendar gives you a better understanding and idea of what your cadence needs to look like, because the last thing we want to see is you guys get in a situation where you hit the end of servicing date, you're not prepared to do an update, and then all of a sudden you're exposed from a security perspective because you're not receiving patches because you've got a percentage of machines that have actually gone end of service. So with that, let's transition to the resource slide. We've created a whole slew of links to help in your process, help to better understand some of the tools, capabilities, features, specifically from a manageability perspective on how to service your estate much more effective. Especially a lot of these links are relatively new, so they're really addressing kind of the servicing of the current day in the remote work scenario. So please leverage these resources. James and I want to thank you all for joining us on this particular session, and keep in mind that we do have 2 more follow-on sessions around prepare, which will be the next session, and then we'll do a deployment session. And then the very last one that I mentioned is more around the business continuity of reimagining IT to support the hybrid workforce. So feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. And again, appreciate you guys jumping on the call with us. Thanks.